I still can't believe this all happened in just 1 month. Just a month ago, David was lying in our bedroom, holding my hand, and now I'm standing at the threshold of my own home, and I'm not allowed to enter. A week after David's funeral, his father, Robert, called me to announce, "We need to discuss the real estate. You don't understand, Sarah, it's not yours." When I arrived home to collect my things for the first night without him, the lock had already been changed. She looked at me not as a daughter-in-law, but as a temporary plug in their perfectly tuned financial mechanism. I'm 35, and until recently, I was just Sarah. For 8 years, I was David's wife. He was my world, my anchor. He built his company from the ground up, a major IT firm called Innovatech, and did it brilliantly. But to his family, the Colemans, I was always something of an error in his calculations, an undesirable variable. David didn't come from money, his family was money, and old money at that. His father, Robert, owned a large construction company, and his mother, Eleanor, engaged in philanthropy but with a look that suggested she was personally loaning money to the poor from her own wallet. They lived in a Seattle suburb, in a mansion where every square foot screamed of untouched, generational wealth. I, on the other hand, grew up in an ordinary family and worked as a nurse until David convinced me to leave to focus on our life together. For Eleanor, that was enough to condemn me. Her contempt was quiet but constant, like background noise that never turned off. At family dinners, while Robert discussed investments with David, Eleanor would address me with endless, pointed hints. "Sarah, you're so practical. I suppose that helps when you don't have, well, family traditions." Or, "We hope you realize David is very generous, but his success is ultimately due to our support, our name." They never asked me to sign a prenup. Robert just told David that family property must remain in the family, and in his mind, that was the end of the discussion. I stayed silent, not wanting to complicate David's life. I never wanted their money, only David and our peace. Everything changed 3 months ago. At his cousin James's wedding, I stepped out into the garden for some air and overheard their conversation. Robert, Eleanor, James, and Michael, David's younger brother. "If something happens to David, the company and the house immediately revert to us, right?" Michael asked. Robert replied with irritating superiority, "Of course. David is too soft-hearted, he won't stipulate harsh terms, but the law of inheritance by blood always protects the family. Sarah will get her personal effects, and the rest will return to where it belongs." Eleanor added, "The main thing is she doesn't start a drama. Those people from the middle class, when it comes to big money, they get very sticky." I returned to the reception and looked at David through different eyes from then on. He was so bright, so kind. He didn't see, or didn't want to see, how deeply his family despised me. But he heard them. He heard everything. That night, when we returned, David was quiet. He hugged me and said, "I know what you heard. I can't change them, but I can protect you." He told me about his attorney, Mr. Howard, whom he hired 6 months ago. I transferred the house, all the accounts, and the company's shares to joint tenancy with right of survivorship. "If anything happens to me, it all automatically becomes yours, Sarah. They'll have nothing to take." I was stunned. He had done this all in secret, protecting me from the people I considered his family. It was the most profound act of love. 6 weeks later, David was diagnosed. Aggressive pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 2 months. I dropped everything to be by his side. He didn't want his family to know about the legal technicalities. "Let them think they've won. It will give them a false sense of security," he said. The last 2 weeks of his life were dedicated not only to fighting the disease but also to finalizing the work with Mr. Howard. "We need an incontestable clause, Charles," David told the attorney. "If they attempt to challenge anything, they must forfeit whatever potential inheritance they might have. I don't just want them to leave empty-handed. I want them to understand why." David died in silence at dawn, holding my hand. That was 3 weeks ago. The funeral followed their script. Eleanor gave me directions on where to sit, as if I were a distant relative and not his wife. "Sarah, you'll sit in the second row. The first row is for family." I didn't argue. I felt numb with grief and knew a brutal awakening was coming for them. 2 days after the funeral, Robert called me. His voice was cold and official. "Sarah, I know you're grieving, but we need to discuss practical matters. You understand this house is the family seat. We want James and his family to move in. For a single woman like you, it will be too much." "This is my home, Robert," I said, and for the first time in 8 years, I said it with force. He laughed, dry and short. "It was your home while David was alive. Now it's Coleman property. We're giving you a week to collect personal items. Don't call again." I stayed with a friend last night because I couldn't be in the house, which felt full of ghosts. I came back today. I knew they would be here. But I didn't expect them to be so confident. I pulled up to the house. James's truck was parked by our gate. The lights were on inside. I watched Michael and James carrying out our sofa, the one we bought with our first big bonus. I got out of the car and immediately noticed the lock on the door. It was new and shiny. I couldn't even insert my key. Robert stood on the porch, holding some papers, his face twisted with a mixture of greed and disdain. "Sarah, you have no business here," he said, not even trying to feign politeness. "We changed the locks to avoid complications. Inventory is underway. Legally, everything in the house is now." I interrupted him, calmly, with the same cold tone he had used with me for the last 8 years. "Robert, you forgot something." He frowned. "What exactly?" I looked at him, at his expensive suit, at his certainty, and saw only a man who was about to lose everything. I wasn't hurt anymore, I was just cold. "You forgot that I'm not alone," I whispered. "David made sure you could never touch me." I took out my phone and dialed the number. "Mr. Howard? They are here. They are changing the locks and moving out our furniture. Could you please come? Right now?" It was at that moment that Mr. Howard's black Mercedes turned the corner. Robert saw him, and his self-assured face began to drain of color for the first time in 3 weeks. The black Mercedes pulled into the driveway, and the sight of Mr. Howard, David's estate lawyer, climbing out with his immaculate leather briefcase, was the single greatest injection of strength I'd had since David died. Robert's face, that arrogant, entitled mask he wore, didn't just pale, it crumpled. He recognized Mr. Howard instantly. Everyone in this corner of Seattle's old money circles knew him. "Mr. Coleman, Mr." Howard's voice cut through the noise of James and Michael wrestling the sofa back into the house. "I am Charles Howard, David's attorney. I believe we need to have a word about what you're doing." Robert straightened his tie, trying to regain his composure. "Howard, what a surprise. You're interrupting a family matter. We are simply, securing David's assets until the estate is settled. This is family property, you understand." He tried to dismiss the lawyer with a wave of his hand, the way he dismissed waiters or telemarketers. Mr. Howard ignored the dismissal and turned to me. "Sarah, are you all right? They changed the locks on you, did they not?" I nodded, still standing in the cold driveway, feeling the new lock mocking me. "The fact that Mrs. Coleman is currently locked out of her own home while valuable items are being removed by unauthorized persons is highly irregular, Robert, Mr. Howard said, emphasizing Robert's first name with a cold, professional edge. "I have documents here that suggest you may be operating under a few incorrect assumptions regarding the legal status of this property." James and Michael stopped mid-struggle with the sofa. Michael, the younger, always the most aggressive, finally spoke. "Assumptions? This house has been in the Coleman family for 3 generations. Sarah was just his wife, a temporary fixture. This was the core of their poison, right there. The belief that I was disposable, easily replaced, a placeholder until the real family could reclaim its assets." "Temporary or not, young man," Mr. Howard countered, "David made certain provisions. Very clear provisions. And you're currently in violation of a potential court order. Robert stepped forward, his eyes darting between me and the briefcase. He was panicking now, but his arrogance wouldn't let him back down completely. David was soft, Howard. He probably signed some papers in the haze of his illness. I'm sure we can clear up this misunderstanding once we see the original will. After all, the house itself. The house and everything in it legally belongs to Sarah Coleman, I stated, cutting him off. It felt good to say those words out loud, to claim what was mine, not just the property, but the right to speak. David made sure of it. Robert laughed, a nervous, forced sound. Nonsense. The law favors blood ties, Howard knows that. You're trying to intimidate her, Sarah. This is harassment. Mr. Howard opened his briefcase, not producing the will yet, but a thick folder. I assure you, I am only here to prevent a much larger legal complication for the Coleman family. I advised David on these matters for months. His wishes were extremely detailed. But we can take this to court, Robert. It will be public. Very public. And I will need to introduce evidence regarding the circumstances under which you changed the locks and began removing furniture 3 weeks after your son's burial. The threat of public exposure, the biggest fear of old, respectable money, hit Robert hard. He looked at James, who just shrugged, visibly defeated. Get the sofa back inside, you two, Robert snapped, suddenly deflated. And put the new lock on the table. We'll meet with you, Howard. Tomorrow. At your office. Bring the documentation. He couldn't fathom that David would have gone to such lengths. In their eyes, David's love for me was a charming flaw, not a calculated, defensive strategy. They believed their own narrative, I was a gold digger, and they were the noble protectors of their lineage. They left, loading the truck back up, the silence of their humiliation louder than all their previous shouting. Robert didn't even look at me again. He simply got into his car and sped away, leaving the new lock lying pathetically on the welcome mat. Mr. Howard stayed behind. We went inside. The house, our house, felt violated, the rooms rearranged, my things moved carelessly. He played them perfectly, Sarah, Mr. Howard said as we sat in the kitchen. David was much stronger than they gave him credit for. When he came to me, he wasn't just planning an estate, he was planning a defense. I spent the rest of the day and night moving through the house, seeing the ghosts of their arrogance. Eleanor hadn't been here, but I knew she was orchestrating this from afar, discussing the situation with her socialites, confident in my imminent eviction. 2 days later, the real escalation began. This is where the emotional tension, already thin, snapped. I was at the old Innovatech office, David's first real office, the one he kept for nostalgia. I was meeting the CEO, Mr. Larson, a man David had mentored, to discuss the transition of my new ownership stake. The company, which had been David's main source of wealth, was now entirely mine. As I walked out, my phone rang. It was my sister, Molly. She sounded terrified. Sarah, where are you? You need to come home right now. Molly, what is it? I'm at the office. It's Eleanor. She came to the house with a truck from a storage company. She has security guards, Sarah. She says she's here to collect her family heirlooms and she's not leaving until they're packed. I felt the familiar, hot surge of betrayal mixed with cold fury. They had promised to wait for the meeting, but they were already breaking the agreement, testing my resolve. They didn't view my temporary victory as a reason to stop, they viewed it as a reason to accelerate their attack. The meeting with Mr. Howard was supposed to be tomorrow. This was a preemptive strike, a blatant attempt to strip the house bare before the legal documents could be officially read. I sped back to the house, heart pounding against my ribs. When I pulled into the driveway, the scene was worse than I imagined. Eleanor, dressed impeccably, stood directing 2 large, uniformed security men who were already rolling an antique Persian rug out the front door. Eleanor. What are you doing here? I demanded, rushing toward her. She didn't flinch. She just tilted her head and gave me the most condescending smile I had ever seen. "Sarah, dear. Don't be dramatic. I told Robert the first simply couldn't wait. These are the Coleman originals. Pieces that have been in the family since the 1920s. They are not covered by David's generosity to you. They are our bloodline's property, and I am removing them for safekeeping. You have no right to be here. This is my property." My voice cracked, betraying the icy calm I was trying to maintain. "Legally, yes, you have temporary rights to the structure," she conceded with theatrical patience. "But the contents? That's a separate matter. Show me a receipt that proves you purchased the Ming vase, the original artwork, or this rug, and I will leave it. Until then, these items are coming home where they belong." The security guards kept moving. It was a perfectly calculated moral dilemma: force a confrontation, or lose irreplaceable, valuable items. I knew those items weren't just about money, they were symbols of the history she believed entitled her to everything. She was taking the physical history of the house, leaving me with an empty shell, stripping my grief down to nothing. "Stop them right now, Eleanor, or I'm calling the police," I warned. "Do it," she whispered, leaning closer. "Call them. I will tell them I'm retrieving my own family property, and you'll be the one having to explain to the Richmond police why you, David's former wife, are trying to steal heirloom furniture from his grieving mother. Let's see whose story sounds more believable to an officer." She knew I was emotionally drained. She knew a police report would be a messy, public nightmare. This was pure psychological warfare, orchestrated by a woman who viewed me not as an enemy, but as a minor pest to be eradicated. I looked at the security guards loading the beautiful, ancient Persian rug, the rug David and I had spent hours lying on, reading together, into their truck. I was powerless, momentarily paralyzed by her cold, absolute certainty. The second act of the Coleman attack had begun, and it was brutal. Eleanor's audacity in the driveway was a different kind of violence than Robert's cold legal threats. Robert operated in the corporate world of contracts and intimidation. Eleanor used social leverage and pure, unadulterated snobbery. She stood there, regal and unmoving, watching her hired muscle roll up the Persian rug that David and I had picked out on our honeymoon. That rug was the scene of countless late-night talks, the place where we mapped out the first phase of Innovatech. Seeing it treated like a piece of salvaged junk, taken by men who were paid not to care, was crushing. I didn't call the police. Eleanor knew I wouldn't. The thought of standing in my own driveway, in a black dress barely 3 weeks out from my husband's funeral, arguing with a police officer about whether an antique vase counted as family property versus marital asset, while Eleanor calmly sipped iced tea, was unbearable. It would have made her the victim of a hysterical widow. That's how she played the game. "Fine," I said, my voice barely a tremor. "You can take your heirlooms, Eleanor. But mark my words, you are trespassing, and you will regret setting foot on this property." She just gave me that pitying, distant look, the one that said, "You are so far beneath me, I don't even hear your threats. Take all the remaining silver, boys," she instructed the guards, completely ignoring me. "And make sure the Ming vase is handled correctly. It's the only one we have left." By the time they were done, the dining room felt hollow, the living room bare and echoey. She took the paintings, the antique side table that had belonged to David's grandmother, but which I had cleaned and polished every week, and, most painfully, she took a small bronze statue of a retriever that David kept on his desk. It wasn't valuable, but David used to tap its nose for luck before every major meeting. It was a petty, calculated cleanup. "Enjoy your large, empty shell, dear," Eleanor called out as she got back into her immaculate SUV. "It's all you'll have left if you try to fight us." She drove away, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the house full of furniture. This wasn't just about property, it was about erasing my presence, erasing the last 8 years of David's life, as if I were a temporary illness he had finally recovered from. The next day, Mr. Howard and I went to his office for the long-awaited meeting. Robert, James, and Michael were already there, sitting stiffly, radiating tense, nervous energy. Eleanor was conspicuously absent, playing the role of the grieving, delicate mother who couldn't handle the stress. The meeting started with Robert's usual posturing. "Howard, let's be reasonable. We all loved David. We understand he was generous to Sarah. But we need to discuss the core assets, the house, the land, and Innovatech. These are ancestral. Sarah, we can offer you a generous settlement, say, $500,000, if you quietly sign over your rights to the house and the company." I looked at the number. $500,000. It was a king's ransom to the girl who worked 3 double shifts to pay for college, but it was pocket change compared to the value of David's assets. It was an insult. "Mr. Howard has the full documentation, Robert," I said, keeping my tone flat. "You need to see the will." Mr. Howard slowly slid the first document across the polished conference table. It wasn't the will yet, but the deed for the house. "Gentlemen," Mr. Howard began, "this property was held in joint tenancy with the right of survivorship. Upon David's death, full, unencumbered ownership transferred immediately and automatically to Sarah. She owns this house, free and clear, as of the moment of David's passing. This is not negotiable. This is a fact of state law." Robert's jaw muscles tightened. James looked like he'd been punched. Michael slammed his hand on the table. "That's impossible. Dad, you said the bloodline clause." "Michael, be quiet," Robert hissed. He looked at Mr. Howard. David was manipulated. He was ill. This document is clearly fraudulent. It was executed 6 months ago, witnessed, and notarized, Mr. Howard replied smoothly, moving on. "Now, let's discuss Innovatech." He presented the second document, a shareholder agreement and revised corporate bylaws, also dated and notarized. All of David's controlling interest, and therefore all of Innovatech, was legally transferred to Sarah Coleman. She is now the sole majority owner. The air in the room went from tense to utterly toxic. Robert's face was a study in pure, concentrated rage and disbelief. His entire empire, the one he thought he was protecting, was legally untouchable by him. "You stole him from us when he was alive, and now you've stolen his legacy when he's dead," Robert spat, directing the venom at me. "David protected me, Robert," I corrected him. "You showed him exactly why I needed protecting when you changed the locks and started looting the house." Just as Robert was about to explode, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and his face changed from anger to a look of utter horror. He stood up, knocking his chair over, and excused himself to take the call. That phone call, I realized later, wasn't part of David's plan. It was the universe throwing another conflict into the pressure cooker. Robert returned 5 minutes later. He was sweating. All the arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate fear. "Sarah," he said, and the shift in his tone was immediate and disturbing. He was no longer using his condescending legal voice, he was pleading. "We have a problem. A major one. Your property issues are no longer mine, Robert," I replied, still reeling from the energy of the meeting. "No, this involves all of us," he insisted. David had a major line of credit open with the First National Bank, tied to the Innovatech shares and the house. It was a flexible investment line he opened 2 months ago. A big one. $6 million. I stared at him. David had never mentioned a massive loan. He was always meticulous about money. "The bank just called," Robert continued, his voice shaking slightly. "The loan was secured by a floating lien on the assets. Now that David is deceased and the ownership has technically changed hands, the bank is reviewing the terms. They found an accelerator clause. They are calling the note due immediately." He slid a bank notice across the table. My eyes focused on the number, $6 million. 00, payable in full within 10 days. "If you can't pay it, Sarah," Robert finished, leaning forward, suddenly trying to appear like an ally, "the bank will foreclose on the house and seize the company assets. All the property David gave you, it will be gone. And, as the new legal owner, the debt falls entirely to you." My heart dropped. David had protected me from his family, but had he left me with a debt that would bankrupt me? I looked at Mr. Howard, who already had his phone out, dialing the bank's number. This wasn't just a threat, it was a ticking financial time bomb, and it had appeared just as I was about to claim my victory. The Colemans had lost the battle over ownership, but David's secret debt might cost me everything anyway. It was a brutal, unexpected twist that tied my fate to Robert's desperate interests once again. The number was a punch to the gut: $6 million. $6 million, due in 10 days. The moment Robert's terrified voice dropped that number, everything shifted. It didn't matter that Mr. Howard had just proven I legally owned the house and Innovatech. It didn't matter that Robert was humiliated. All the legal maneuvers, David's fierce final act of protection, it all looked fragile now, like a sandcastle facing a sudden tide. The Coleman family's petty, jealous attempts to steal my home suddenly seemed minor compared to the sheer, crushing weight of that debt. "This is impossible," I managed, staring at the bank notice. The paper was crisp and sterile, but the implications were messy and catastrophic. David was obsessive about his finances. He would never take out a loan that size without telling me, let alone one secured against everything we own with an accelerator clause. Mr. Howard, ever the professional, was already on the phone with his contact at First National. Robert, however, was a completely different person. The mask of the contemptuous patriarch was gone, replaced by the desperate, sweating businessman. "You have to believe me, Sarah, I didn't know about this loan," Robert pleaded, the sudden use of my first name sounding jarringly familiar and utterly fake. "But listen, we can help each other. We are family, David's family. If you can't pay this in 10 days, the bank gets everything. The house, the company, the land. It all goes up for auction." James and Michael looked at their father, then at the bank notice, their expressions slowly morphing from disbelief to a sickening flicker of renewed hope. "So, here's my proposal," Robert continued, leaning across the table, his voice low and urgent. "You sign over 51% of Innovatech to me, enough for me to take control and stabilize the company. I have the liquid assets. I can pay the $6 million immediately, right now. I save David's legacy, and you save the house. You keep 49% of the company and you're debt-free." He was offering a lifeboat, but the price was control. He was leveraging David's hidden mistake to force the very thing David died trying to prevent, giving Robert access to and control over the company. The irony was suffocating. David protected me from their greed, and now an unforeseen debt was handing them the keys anyway. "And what happens to my 49% once you have control?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the hurricane inside. "You sell it off, you freeze me out. You run the company into the ground out of spite, and I'm left with nothing but an empty house." "That's not true," Robert protested, but his eyes didn't meet mine. "I'm protecting David's business. This is the only way to keep the company from falling into the bank's hands." Mr. Howard hung up the phone, his face grave. "Robert is not entirely wrong, Sarah. The bank confirms the loan and the 10-day due date. It's absolutely standard for a single borrower to have such a clause. Given the scale, contesting the debt is a losing battle. The note must be paid. Your only options are to pay the $6 million yourself, get a rapid bridge loan, which is nearly impossible in this time frame, or accept Robert's offer." The weight of the moral dilemma settled on me like a physical burden. David had trusted me. He had fought hard, secretly, to protect my autonomy and his company from his father. If I accepted Robert's help, I would be betraying David's final wishes. I would be ceding control to the man who called me a temporary fixture, and whose wife had just looted my living room. But if I refused, I risked losing everything David built, the house, the company, the financial future, to the cold, indifferent hands of the bank. I looked at the house deed, the proof of David's love, and then at the debt notice, the proof of his final, catastrophic blind spot. "I need to see the original loan documents," I said, turning to Mr. Howard. "I need to know exactly how David justified this and what collateral he used." Mr. Howard arranged a meeting at the bank for the next morning. Robert left, convinced I would call him that evening, his fear replaced by smug anticipation. He had me over a barrel. He knew it. That night, I was sitting alone in the echoey dining room, trying to process the enormity of the $6 million knife hanging over my head. Eleanor's empty spaces mocked me, the bare wall where the Ming vase had hung, the clean patch of floor where the Persian rug had been. I was searching through David's study, looking for any stray financial papers, desperate for a clue about the loan, when I found a hidden compartment in the back of his safe. It wasn't full of cash or jewelry, just a single, worn leather journal. David hadn't used a physical journal in years. I opened it. It was dated starting 3 months ago, right after we overheard the Colemans at James's wedding. It wasn't a diary, it was a ledger, meticulously logging his final legal and financial actions. As I read, my hands began to tremble, and a realization hit me with the force of a wrecking ball. This wasn't just about the $6 million, this was about the final, ultimate twist David had planned. He had indeed taken out the $6 million loan 2 months ago. The journal confirmed it. But the purpose wasn't for some investment or company expansion. The entry was chillingly brief. Loan proceeds deposited into account number 447. Collateral, Innovatech shares and 100% equity in the house. Purpose, weaponization. Weaponization? I flipped pages frantically, stopping at the entry made just 4 days before his death. Howard signed off on the final provision today. They think the debt is a weakness, a way back in. They'll offer the cash to save the assets and demand control. I need them to believe that. I need them to believe I made a mistake. The journal then detailed the crucial, hidden step. David hadn't just taken out the loan, he had immediately transferred the $6 million into an irrevocable trust established in my name, a trust that Robert, as the family patriarch, had absolutely no legal knowledge of and no right to touch. The trust was set up specifically to be untraceable by the Colemans and structured to pay off any associated debt upon his death. The full $6 million was sitting there, waiting, completely clean of Robert's influence. But there was one final, breathtaking detail, the ultimate moral gambit. The journal continued, the trust is activated when Sarah sends the coded message to Howard. But the purpose of the loan wasn't just to cover the assets. I created a $6 million cash value because that is the price they are willing to pay for control. I have left the door open for Sarah. She now has the money to pay the debt herself and the power to take Robert's money instead, using his own greed against him. I want her to see how badly they want control. I want her to make the choice, fully protected, about whether they deserve the penalty for their cruelty. David hadn't left me with a debt, he had given me a massive, protected cash reserve and a perfect trap. He wanted me to see the full extent of Robert's desperation and greed before revealing my hand. He wanted me to face the moral dilemma, should I silently pay the debt with David's money, preserving my clean hands, or should I take Robert's $6 million to pay the debt, forcing him to hemorrhage his own cash while losing all control and leverage? I held the journal, the weight of David's genius and his deep, protective anger overwhelming me. I now had 10 days to decide how to use the weapon he had left me. I had the power to devastate Robert, financially and psychologically, simply by accepting his offer to save the family legacy. And I knew exactly how badly he deserved it. I sat there in David's study, the soft lamplight catching the worn leather of his journal. It wasn't just a ledger, it was a blueprint for revenge, a testament to how deeply he had seen and understood his own family's cruelty. He hadn't made a mistake. He had laid a perfect, $6 million trap. The moral dilemma hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I had the safe option, send the code to Mr. Howard, pay off the debt with the untraceable trust fund David had created, and walk away clean. I would keep the house, the company, and my integrity, having fought their greed with silent, lawful defense. But then there was the other option, the one David had called weaponization. I could accept Robert's offer, let him transfer his own $6 million to pay the debt, and then, after he'd signed away his cash, reveal the will and the fact that he'd just purchased 51% of a company he could never actually control. I would be using Robert's own greed against him, forcing him to pay a massive financial penalty for his years of contempt and his attempted looting of my home. I looked at the empty space where Eleanor had taken David's lucky bronze retriever statue. I remembered the casual cruelty in Robert's voice when he told me the house was no longer mine. They had never treated me as a wife, only as an obstacle. They had not allowed me the dignity of grief. They had started their attack immediately after David's burial. David wanted me to choose. He had given me protection and power. He had essentially set up an execution, and I was holding the trigger. I didn't sleep that night. I walked through the house, the emotional residue of Eleanor's theft mingling with the devastating realization of David's final sacrifice. He had put so much energy, his remaining time, into this intricate legal defense, not just to secure the assets, but to give me the satisfaction of victory. By morning, my choice was crystal clear. They had to pay the price for their certainty. I called Robert first. My voice was calm, almost cheerful. "Robert, I've thought about your offer. The bank's deadline is too tight. I don't have time to secure a bridge loan. I accept your terms." There was a pause, and then I could hear the sheer, unadulterated triumph in his voice. "Sarah, that's wise. Very wise. We'll save David's legacy together." He sounded like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "I need two things, Robert," I continued. "One, the full $6 million must be wired directly to the First National Bank account number listed on the notice by noon today. I will confirm the payment. 2, we meet at Mr. Howard's office at 2 p.m. to sign the contract transferring the 51% stake." Robert agreed instantly, too blinded by his impending victory, control of Innova Tech, to worry about the tight deadline. The day moved with brutal efficiency. At 11:30 a.m., Mr. Howard called, his voice tight. "The transfer is complete, Sarah. Robert Coleman just paid $6 million to the bank. The debt is settled." I felt a chilling lack of emotion. The house and the company were safe. The first part of David's plan was executed. At 2 p.m., I met Robert, James, and Michael at Mr. Howard's office. Robert was expansive, almost jovial. He placed the contract on the table, the agreement giving him 51% of Innova Tech. "Before we sign this, Robert," I said, my hand resting on the leather journal I had brought with me, "I have one final condition. I want you to read something David wrote." Robert rolled his eyes but couldn't afford to argue now. "Fine, whatever. Get on with it, Sarah." Mr. Howard slid a thick envelope across the table. It was the letter David had written, the one detailing 8 years of his family's cruelty. The letter that accompanied the final, comprehensive will. Robert took the letter, his brow furrowed in annoyance. As he began to read David's careful handwriting, documenting every slight, every dismissive comment, the conversation at the wedding, the assumptions about my middle-class greed, the color slowly drained from his face. James and Michael leaned over his shoulders, their expressions shifting from impatience to abject horror. When he reached the end, Robert looked up at me, his eyes wet with a mixture of betrayal and pure, concentrated shock. He planned this," Robert whispered. "All of it?" "He did," I confirmed, standing up. "He saw exactly who you were, Robert. You called me a temporary fixture. He worked for years to ensure I was permanent, protected, and powerful. I pulled out David's final will. The $6 million you just paid to settle the debt was unnecessary. David paid that debt 2 weeks ago by placing the exact amount in a trust fund, designed to be released only after his will was challenged. He protected me from the bank, and he protected me from you." Robert stared at the will, then at the contract that would give him 51% of the company he craved. "And now for the final provision," I stated, placing the will in front of him. "This comprehensive will, which legally supersedes the transfer you were about to sign, leaves 100% of Innova Tech, the house, and all remaining assets, to me. Every single thing." James lunged for the paper. "This is fraudulent. We'll contest this. Read the fine print, James, Mr. Howard interjected, his voice sharp and final. He pointed to a paragraph on the last page. "The no contest clause. Any attempt to challenge this will, or any of the preceding ownership deeds, results in the automatic forfeiture of any potential inheritance or claim. Furthermore, given your attempt to remove property from the premises last week, I have documentation here to charge you with theft. You will not challenge this. You cannot afford to. Robert slumped back into his chair. He had poured $6 million of his own cash into a debt that was already paid. He had sacrificed the money to gain control, only to discover that the control he thought he was buying had been legally out of his reach for months. His family legacy was now mine, bought with David's money and Robert's own desperate greed. I looked at the defeated men, seeing not enemies, but just empty suits who had been bested by a man they thought was too soft-hearted. I left the office alone, the leather journal under my arm. I never signed Robert's contract. He was forced to accept that his $6 million payment secured a debt on property he did not and would never control. He got nothing but the bitter, public knowledge that his son's final act was a complete, documented rejection of everything he stood for. I returned to my house, now entirely mine, clean of debt and clean of their influence. The emptiness left by Eleanor's petty theft no longer felt like a wound, it felt like space for something new. I was a 35-year-old widow, a single owner of a multi-million-dollar tech company, a woman protected by a love that proved stronger than a lifetime of familial malice. I still miss David every second. But sometimes, when I sit in the quiet living room, looking at the spot where the ugly, antique side table used to be, I wonder, did David do this to protect me, or did he do it to punish them? The line between the two was so thin, I suspect he intended for the answer to be both. And that, I realize, is what makes his final act of love so perfectly, beautifully tragic.